Okay, lepo pozdravljeni, lep pozdrav vsem skupaj. Also, hello everyone here at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, and also hello to those who are connected with us through Zoom. So it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you at the first event of our History on the Edge, the festival History on the Edge, starting today, and then there will be around 12 events throughout June. I hope that you are all familiar with the program of the festival, which you can find on the website of the Institute and on the Institute webpage. So I was responsible for the program, but of course the organization of such event would not be possible without support and help of my colleagues here at the Institute. And I would like to thank Andrei Panchur, the director of the Institute, and Marko Zajc, the head of the Department for Political History, to immediately support this idea of organizing a history festival. Then I would like to thank Darja Vipavc and Tina Tratnik for their help with the organization. Many thanks also to Neja Vlajk-Hribar for making sure of spreading the information about the festival through social media. And I would also like to thank Karin Konda, Urška Svetina, Marko Kuplen, and Sergej Škopljanec for their technical support. And of course, last but not least, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Institute for their very helpful suggestions. And now I'm very delighted to introduce our first speaker, Helen Yaffe. Helen Yaffe is a lecturer of economic and social history at the University of Glasgow. Her teaching focuses on Latin American and Cuban development. Since 1995, when she was still a teenager, she has spent time living and researching in Cuba. Her first book, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, was published in 2009. And then in 2017, together with Gavin Brown, she published the book Youth Activism and Solidarity, the Non-stop Picket Against Apartheid. In 2020, she published the book We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, of which I'm a proud owner of, which was published by the Yale University Press. The book examines the astonishing developments that took place in Cuba in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. Helen also co-produced a documentary film, Cuba's Life Test, Combating Climate Change, and just finished her online world tour of this documentary. And the documentary also available on the YouTube. So Helen, thank you so much for coming to Ljubljana. We are very much looking forward to your lecture with the title Democracy and Participation in Revolutionary Cuba. So the lecture will take about 1 hour plus
up to.
And then followed by discussion. So you can already think about your comments or questions, and also those listening through via Zoom. You can write your questions, and then we will read them here. So Helen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to start by thanking the lovely Anna Kladnik and the Institute of Contemporary History for inviting me. It's my first visit to Slovenia, and it's also my first live in-person lecture for, 3 years and a bit, because I've been lecturing online. So yes, a little bit nervous.
I think it deserves the applause.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I'm discussing democracy and participation in revolutionary Cuba. This is the National Assembly of People's Power. I'll explain how it functions. I'm going to start by looking at concepts and definitions, power, democracy, participation, human rights, and freedom, because it's really important that we lay out the foundations of what we're actually talking about. I'll explain how Cuba's political system functions and also the organizations of the masses. I'll also talk about some of the national debates and consultations, which is another aspect of their participation. If we have time, well, I will discuss class and privilege and the idea of a workers' state. And if we have time, I'll go on and look a little bit about racism, discrimination, gender equality, women, and sexual diversity. In each section, looking at the situation pre-59 and sort of summarizing where we are now. Bear in mind, I'm covering a lot, so I'm going to be touching on themes, and you're more than welcome to please, note down things, more questions and comments as we go through. So starting with the concept of power, democracy and participation. That's obviously the title of my talk. So democracy, and I should say, I'm not an expert in this field, but to talk about, I study Cuban development, to talk about democracy in a different paradigm, it's really important to investigate the terms. So democracy, as you'll know, is an ancient Greek word for popular government or people's rule. And someone has calculated that there are at least 550 adjectives that have been used to qualify the words democracy. Some examples that are most well known: delegative, participatory, representative, popular, workers, social, deficient, illiberal, organic, direct, two-party, multi-party, proportional representation. So you get the picture, right? So when we talk about democracy, maybe we should clarify what we mean. Democracy is also used as synonymous with participation and with freedom. So we need to think about these because both of these terms are also interpreted in different ways. Participation, by whom, on behalf of whom? So we could say that we have two distinct forms of participation. Indirect participation, which has been described as handing your sovereignty over when you vote for someone to represent you. So you elect usually a career politician or a party representative to act for you. And there's this issue of split loyalties. So you are the constituent who elects, but the representative is under the discipline of the party line, right? And you see that often. People vote for a local representative who then takes up a policy, votes with a government line, which actually goes against the interests of the constituents who elected them. Direct participation, so self-representation of community or sectoral groups, decentralized power and responsibility. What checks and balances might we want to see can be introduced in this system? Okay, now obviously, when we talk about democracy, it is conflated often with the question of human rights and freedom. So we need to investigate those terms as well. Addressing the issue of human rights involves philosophical questions about the nature of freedom. From what, to do what, to whom? So, certainly in the sort of the tradition I've looked at, the British tradition, there are generally two distinct forms of freedom philosophically. Freedom from necessity. So freedom to have your needs met, including in education, healthcare, housing, and sustenance. Now, interestingly, this was the basis of Ernest Bevin proposing the National Health Service and what became state welfare, or welfare state as it was known in Britain, in the post-Second World War period. Freedom from necessity. And then there is the freedom of choice associated with liberal economics. And what's emphasized here is the right to pursue self-interest. So that might be the right to accumulation, set up a business, make money, and so on. The right to consume what you want, consumer choice, expressed through the market, demand and supply. Freedom of political association, freedom of speech. Now, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights recognizes two distinct sets of rights. They recognize together economic, social, and cultural rights, and they recognize civil rights and political liberties, but they don't prioritize either set morally or legally. The extent to which they are reconcilable is a big discussion. Yeah, if you accept political liberty, the right to set up a business, are you also giving people the right to violate economic rights because they may be exploited, or environmental rights, or cultural rights, or social rights? Yeah. So those are big questions. I'm not proposing to answer them, but I think it's really important when we discuss, for example, democracy in Cuba, that is our sort of context. Liberal capitalist countries highlight civil rights and political liberties. Cuba prioritizes economic, social, and cultural rights. This is openly articulated. The choice of rights that a system prioritizes is determined by which are compatible with their economic system. Okay, so you have here, this is a picture of the Second Amendment of the United States, the right to bear arms. So less disputed in either of these systems is the right to life. Yeah, well, right to life and security. But is it guaranteed? The US Constitution has the right to bear arms, Second Amendment. And we've just seen that another devastating massacre. So that's a right to bear arms. How does that fit with the right to life? Okay, politics and democracy. More questions. I'm throwing questions at here. If you came here to get answers, all you're getting so far is questions. What is power? How do elites sustain privilege? What is the link between political and economic systems? So you have the Marxist concept of infrastructure and superstructure. I'm sure you're aware of that, articulated particularly clearly through Lenin's State and Revolution. Yeah. So it's not a coincidence, the kind of educational, religious infrastructure you have, it's linked to the economic relations. And that's, like the question of freedom and democracy. So I'm pointing out this book. I think it's very useful. It focuses on Latin America. There's two chapters, or a chapter on Cuba, a chapter on Venezuela, Democracy and Revolution, Latin American Socialism Today by D.L. Raby. And Raby points out a few things which I think are useful. Parliamentary liberalism, which is the political expression of originally Western capitalism, economic liberalism, has monopolized the term democracy when referring to a form of political organization preferred in the advanced capitalist countries, the multi-party electoral system. Democracy is ascribed to free elections, freedom of speech, political organization, and political pluralism, multi-parties. But very little is said about economic and social rights, the distribution of power or wealth, and the market economy is often added to the definition of democracy, implicitly excluding the socialist system. This is really key. I may say this later, but if you look at the US legislation that promotes and encourages and fosters regime change in Cuba today, since the 60s, it says we will not lift US sanctions, we will not take these measures until Cuba introduces a market system and a multi-party election. So they that what they say democracy. So they certainly conflate the two. Those who regard parliamentary liberalism, multi-party capitalist system, as synonymous with democracy, they look at Cuba, they find it missing, and conclude that Cuba is not democratic. It's a one-party state. So for people who come with that perspective, this lecture can end now. Cuba is not a democratic state because it doesn't have that system, if that's the only perception that you have of democracy. But we can ask, what about participatory democracy? Now, I want to step back and look at this is so important. Teaching students about Cuba, Cuban development, Cuban history. English language texts in academia on Cuba are dominated by a school of interpretation, a paradigm which was actually politically consciously set up. It self-named itself Cubanology in the 70s. It was initially set up, the first institutions were funded through the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon. And it had two main objectives. Academics were enrolled to present a negative image about the Cuban Revolution. So it starts in 61. Why 61? Because the Bay of Pigs invasion had happened. The Cuban government defeated the invasion, which was a group of exiles who were funded and trained by the CIA. And they were defeated by the new revolutionary government within 72 hours. And of course, the Cubans were extremely triumphant. It's called the first defeat for US imperialism in the Americas. So what it showed from the establishment perspective in the US is that the Cuban Revolution was a more stable and enemy that was there to stay. So it needed to be studied in order for programs to be prepared to combat it. So two objectives. One, to provide information for planning future programs. And it is incredible. Like, there are professors like Professor Edward Gonzalez, this highly esteemed professor, who's writing reports for the Rand Corporation and the CIA. There are opportunities to promote regime change in this area. Yeah. And then the second objective was to present negative information about Cuban developments, to undermine official sources, to say that anyone who is in a Cuban institution is a mouthpiece of the dictatorship. They have no critical capacities and so on. So there are a set of key tenets within this paradigm, and they are the following. The revolution of 1959 presents a rupture in Cuban history. Something went wrong. Yeah. And therefore, the argument is you need to get back on the development track. Fidel Castro, and subsequent to 2006, when he becomes ill and steps down, Raul Castro takes over. They are synonymous with the Cuban Revolution. They personally dominate domestic developments and Cuban foreign policy. So much of this text will tell you that the decisions that are made in any period in Cuba is to do with Fidel Castro's biology or psychology. Like, he was in his young idealist stage, and then he became older and more pragmatic. Yeah. How these scholars know the psychological states of Fidel Castro, we don't know. They never tell us. It's always assumed. And also, the rest of Cuba are revolutionary people who've had free revolutionary wars for independence. They've had uprisings of black people. They've had a revolution of 1933, set Soviets up all over the country. Post 1959, they're converted into a passive mass, incapable of affecting policy because Fidel Castro is in power, right? That's one of the tenets. Hence, the next one, there is no democracy and civil society is repressed. So the massive organizations of the masses, which I'm going to talk about, they don't exist in the literature practically. They're censored, or they're just sort of people are forced to participate, and it's not organic or authentic. Another one is that Cuban economic growth since 1959 has been negligible, largely due to mismanagement of the economy. Now, this is an overview of Cuban economic growth. It's actually been more or less parallel to the Latin American experience. You can see this collapse. This is really important. I mean, I'm not talking about it today, but I am an economic historian, and the book is about how Cuba survived this collapse. This is the collapse of the Soviet bloc and Eastern European socialist countries, and the devastating impact that has on Cuba. But, nonetheless, look at the recovery. And also, while emphasizing mismanagement and these Cubans who don't understand, they make one policy and then they, mess it up with another, very little is said about the United States blockade. This is the mightiest economic power in the world, dominates the international financial system. The dollar is the international currency, and And it has a blockade of Cuba for 60 years, which the Cubans estimate has cost over $144 billion. So absolutely devastating for a small island nation that is by its nature dependent on trade. And, before the revolution, completely a dependency of the US economy, right? So next, dependency on the United States, which I just mentioned, was replaced by dependency on the USSR, the Soviet Union. And subsequently, there are attempts to portray this dependency being switched to Venezuela post-2000 under Hugo Chavez. The statistics prove that that's not the case at all. Now, these ideas shape discourse on Cuba. And they also obstruct our ability to see clearly what goes on in Cuba or explain the revolution's endurance or Cuban society's vitality. So that's what I was trying to do with my book, is actually talk about Cuba as a real country with real people. Right. So I've been talking for 15 minutes and I'm finally getting on to the political system. So I'm a historian. I approach everything first with the historical context. Pre-1959, well, actually, the Cuban Revolution has three important wars of independence. So most of Latin America gets its independence in the 1820s. Cuba, Brazil, they remain under Spanish. It's under the Spanish Empire. They have important wars of independence. Slavery continues in Cuba much later. And the Cubans are very close to winning their final war of independence when the United States intervenes militarily, occupies the island, and then says, we're not leaving. When the Cubans protest, they say, well, we'll only leave if you embed the Platt Amendment in your new constitution. Now, the Platt Amendment gives it's very short, very simple, but it gives the United States the right to intervene militarily and politically whenever they choose. National security, right? That's something we're now very accustomed to hearing. So the Cuban constitution is practically written in Washington, yeah? So this is a characteristic. Political institutions in Cuba are shaped by the Platt Amendment and US direct and indirect intervention. So the US says, we're not happy with the Cuban president. We'll send an emissary. We'll tell him to leave, right? And that happens repeatedly. It's an incredibly tumultuous history. And I said they have a revolution in 1933 and so on. They also know dictatorship. Right? Most of you will have heard of the Batista dictatorship, but they have a dictatorship between 1928 and 1933, the Machado dictatorship, which is thrown out by this revolution of 1933 in the context of the Great Depression, which affects Latin America acutely. And they have further dictatorships under Batista as the strongman 34 to 40. And then again, he comes back 52 to 58 when the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, throws him out. Political parties are banned in all of these periods. They have also known a period of liberal parliamentary elections between 1940 and 52. So probably the Cubans within a 100-year period have known more different forms of political governance than most populations, yeah? Post-1959, 1st of January, Batista leaves on New Year's Eve, he cheers his cronies and off he goes. Packs up the suitcases full of the cash and off they go. So the new revolutionary state just sort of reinstitutes the constitution, restates the constitution of 1940. But it doesn't reintroduce multi-party elections in that period. And it takes them until 1976 to introduce a new constitution. So in this time, the revolutionary government is in power. Now, there are forms of representation, mobilization, and democracy, if we regard it in that way, set up through popular councils, organizations of the masses. But it's not until 1976 with a new constitution that this gets institutionalized. The new constitution is approved by a national referendum. And one element in the constitution is that any big decision has to be approved in a national referendum. So they introduced what's called the organs of people's power. It has 3 levels, municipal. So I guess that's like boroughs in the UK. I don't know what you'd call them here. And then provincial. So there's 14. I mean, it changes. There's 7 provinces and there's 14 now. There's 15 in Cuba. So you get the impression. And then national. There are 3 very important tenets of Cuban electoral system. 1, these are non-party elections. So bear that in mind when we talk about a one-party state. It's both a one-party state with non-party elections. Okay, it's complex, but we'll discuss. 2, delegates, i.e. the people elected, are not paid. There's no career politicians. There's no professional. It's not a professional position. So you are a tobacco worker. When you get elected, you continue to get the salary of your tobacco worker wage, and your job has to release you for the days that you go to the parliament. It's not a professional parliament that sits all the time. It has 2 ordinary sessions a year, which are several days, and then emergency sessions as and when needed. But they do, I'll explain this actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. The 3rd point is accountability. Delegates must, what they call it, render accounts at least every 6 months to their own constituents. So if they're elected at a street level, they have to pull together this street and say, these were your complaints, this is what I did, this is why I couldn't resolve these problems, or this is how far I got in resolving those problems, and they can be recalled by 1/3, not 50%, but 1/3 of the electorate. And that happens. There are some statistics in Raby's book about how frequently people were recalled. Okay, voting age, 16 plus at lower levels, 18 plus at National Assembly. Really important note here. The Cuban political system has evolved over 6 decades. It's not static. In fact, I'm going to present it to you how it was until 2019, because a new constitution was approved by national referendum, which has eliminated one of the levels, right? And introduced a prime minister again for the first time. So that's not what I'm presenting to you, because this is how it has been developed over this period. Okay, this is the system of people's power. So if you think of someone's described it as an inverse triangle, yeah, with the mass at the top. So first of all, you start with individuals. Remember, no parties. Individuals stand in elections. And I was talking to Anna last night. They can't nominate themselves. They have to be nominated by their peers. Who they are, I'll explain as we go through. There are 169 municipalities in Cuba. So the individuals are elected first at street level. Then from the street level, you're electing between those presidents up into the municipal assembly. Delegates are directly proposed. There's no self-nomination. They're elected every 2.5 years, and they continue in their existing jobs with their existing pay. It's a voluntary job. Except for there'll be an administrative committee that, that organizes everything. Can you see this picture? Oh, I've got a pointy thing here. These pictures up here, yeah? This is, at every level of the election, it's what people have for their electioneering. 1 A4 sheet with the same size photo, which lists all of the organizations they're a member of, and it's sort of promoting themselves on the basis of what we have done for this community or my country. Like I fought against the apartheid regime in Angola, for the freedom of against the invasion of South Africa and Angola, or I organise to get the women over 60 to get mammograms, or I organise a local football team, that sort of thing, right? No advertising. No, there is actually no advertising in Cuba except government sort of public health things, right? You really notice it when you first go. Okay, so that's at any level, that's all you get. There's no advantages to people who can, get more money. Okay, so from the municipal assembly, then you have elections up to the provincial assembly. This is the layer that's just been eliminated, but I'm still going to present it because it's been relevant in this period. There are 15 provinces, elections are every 5 years. And from the provincial assembly, you elect into the National Assembly. National Assembly has, I don't know, like 612, 615 delegates. And the elections are every 5 years. Half of them come up through the neighbourhood elections from the municipalities, through provinces, into the National Assembly. I remember going to Guantanamo. You've heard of Guantanamo, of course. It's infamous because the United States refuses to give up the legally occupied territory it has there, where it has the naval base, which has been used as a, for the torture of non-combatants and so on. I went to this town that's closest to Guantanamo, and this black peasant woman who lives in this area, grew up in that area. And she is the representative for her region in the National Assembly. So we said, how close do you feel to Havana? Here, how much can you affect the policies? And she said, I'm right there. I'm in the seat of power, because it's a long journey, but she gets there and she's up in the National Assembly. Okay, so 50% of the delegates there come through that neighbourhood system. The other half are from what's called nominating assemblies. So that might be the workers, the trade unions on these commissions with their youth representatives, women's organisations, students, farmers. They all have organisations, as I'll discuss. CDRs is the street committees. Now, the one criticism people make is that they are nominated. It's not the same electoral process. And then a slate is presented and it's a yes/no vote. But changes have been made, as I've said. So the National Assembly is the highest organ of power in Cuba. It has the greatest constituent and legislative authority. It meets twice yearly, and in between, the work is led by permanent commissions. So they might be on education, on healthcare, on industry. They have one now on racism, and these people will be full-time or almost full-time, and they will be paid. Those are the people who are paid, and they come from the National Assembly delegates. They control decisions and implementation. So the Constitution also says that the most important changes to law must be introduced by referendum, and we've seen a recent example. What's the composition of, got my thingy here, but the composition of the National Assembly today from the 2018 election, the most recent? 605 delegates, 53.2% are women, that's the second highest in the world, and 40.6% are black or mixed. This is still considered, Raul Castro introducing the results just before he retired, said, it's better, but we're still not satisfied. But bear in mind that the Cuban census, where people self-identify, actually says something like 60% of the population is white. That's disputed. I'll get onto that because, it's legacies. Anyway, we'll discuss later. And this is really interesting. 13.5% are under 35. So if you can see the pictures of the National Assembly, it's quite stark how young people are. Young women, young black women, which you certainly don't see much in Britain, let alone anywhere else. Okay, so this sounds great, yeah? It sounds really representative. But what about the Castros? I mean, we have an anomaly, right? There's Fidel Castro, yeah? All the way up to 2006. So what you have is the Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, are part of this process, elected into the National Assembly, right? Now, I remember a conversation where someone from England was saying to a Cuban friend of mine, are you telling me that I could stand as a candidate against Fidel Castro? And she said, yeah, sure, you can stand, but I won't vote for you because we have a meritocracy and I can't see that you've done more than Fidel Castro for Cuba, right? So there they are. They're in the National Assembly. Now, the National Assembly then elects a president, a vice president, a secretary, and they also elect a council of state, which elects a council of ministers. As I said, this is how it was until 2019-20 when the changes have come through. That council of ministers is like a government or a cabinet, and they don't have to be from within the National Assembly. So you can get someone who's a medic to be the Minister of Health, right? The Council of State is around 30 members. They have some executive powers to operate between national assemblies. The Council of State elects its president and vice president. It operates collective decision-making. The president does not have individual decision-making powers. What's the significance of this? If you look here, this side. So, who has been the president of the Council of State? Fidel Castro in those dates, then Raúl, and now Miguel Díaz-Canel. So we always refer to Fidel as the president of Cuba. But I have been endlessly corrected by Cubans who say he's not the president of Cuba. He's the president of this Cuban Council of State. And he has less power than the British Prime Minister to just bring on someone to become the Minister of the Treasury or some lucrative position, right? Which is something we see a lot. Okay, so, and I put this quote here. You know, this is what Sky News after Fidel died. Fidel Castro, legendary hero or cruel dictator. And I'm trying to get at how do we unpick such polarized interpretations of his role in Cuba? You know, some people say it's a dictatorship and some say it's a grassroots democracy. So how do we understand that? Okay, in addition to the political system of election and representation, you of course have the organizations of the masses. Now, the ones I've put in purple were founded in the years I've said, so pre-1959, right? Very radical. This is again a tradition in Latin America, inspired in fact by a student movement in Argentina from 1918, Córdoba. Federation of University Students in Cuba was set up in 1922. It played a really big part in the Revolution of 1933 and the Revolution of 1959. And the Cuban Trade Union Confederation, the name was changed, but it was set up in 1939, set up by a communist sugar worker, and then it sort of changes its form, but it's the same organization post-59. New organizations of the masses, as they're called in Cuba, the Union of Young Communists, set up in 1960, so the year after the revolution. This matters because I said they didn't introduce that structure until 76. Then you have the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. Also, these are street committees set up in 1960. The Federation of Cuban Women, set up in 1960 by Vilma Espin, who was one of the leading Cuban revolutionaries. The Association of Small Farmers, ANAP, 1961, which has also been very important. There are others as well, but these are the main ones. And millions of Cubans are in these. All right? And that matters because, again, going back to US legislation, it says, you know, in our post-transition Cuba, which we will help to manage, you know, we will not allow anyone who's been in Cuban official organizations to take part. So you're actually excluding all of these people, right? In 1988, between 88, they do everything. They experiment, they try new forms out, and then they roll them out. But 1991, so you'll notice that's the special period, the post-Soviet period, they introduced new people's councils. So the more difficult the situation got in Cuba, their response was always to create more low-level grassroots authority and organization, yeah? And I argue in the book that that's been a big part of Cuba surviving. Okay, so you have People's Councils set up. They're made from the municipal delegates, remember the municipal assembly, or the delegates that are in there in every area are in a People's Council, along with representatives from the mass organizations, so women, students, small farmers, trade unions, and state enterprises in each area. So they're supposed to talk, communicate, coordinate, mobilize together, and make sure that, you know, there's shared interest. They elect a vice president and a president. They have no administrative responsibility, but Uriarte, in an Oxfam report in 2002, described them as aggressive advocates of local issues. Yeah? Okay, follow the leader. What I argue is that the relationship between the government and the people through their organizations is extremely permeable. And that matters for that, you know, I was just talking about the US legislation, right? Do you regard members of the street committee as members of the government, because they are part of the structure and hierarchy, and they feed into policy making and so on. Cuban socialism has survived with the backing of the majority. Now, that does not mean that there aren't opponents in Cuba. We know they are. That doesn't mean that people don't have complaints or aren't fed up. Of course there is. But the revolution hasn't survived on the back of repression. And I'll go on and say something else. So denying this leads to distortion and misconstructions about legitimacy and the balance of power. That key tenet of Cubanology that describes all Cubans as passive victims, incapable of voicing their opposition. Yeah, which is, anyway. On the other hand, we must recognize the indefatigable leadership, dominance and authority of first Fidel Castro and subsequently Raul Castro, not in the same way, right? But they talk in Cuba, they use this discourse of moral authority, yeah? And the question was whether Miguel Díaz-Canel, the new president who was born after the revolution, entirely a product of Cuban socialism, would he have the moral authority to hold the system together? So far he has. Well, we'll see. Military historian Hal Klepak has pointed out that neither the FAR, that's the Revolutionary Armed Forces, nor even important police resources were ever needed in an internal security role to quell civil unrest. I think this is phenomenal. If you go back to that economics graph I showed and think about that collapse, they had one protest that lasted a few hours in Havana. And it was dealt with by farmers on the edge who are in Havana province, who came in on their trucks, and said, who's messing with the revolution? We're here to quell it. Now, obviously, we saw last summer, for the first time, national protests, violent protests, which shocked Cubans. I was in Cuba at that time. And what we saw is that the police and the response was chaotic. They were not prepared because they do not have the experience. Yeah. And if you look at what happened in Latin America on that day, in Chile and Bolivia and Paraguay, there were violent protests and people were killed. Nothing was said in the press about it. But the first, one-off protests, it was for Cuba shocking. But, that's part of the response. They don't have experience in social unrest and civil and control. Okay, so I argue that the projects that the Castros, as it's seen, initiated were dependent on their ability to get the population behind them. Hence the need that we've seen in Cuba to constantly go to the people, to explain, to urge, to debate, to obtain consent in order to mobilize people to action. Fidel Castro is famous for his 4-hour speeches, 5-hour speeches, and so on. The longest ever speech at the United Nations. But that was normal for the Cuban people. And it's sort of mocked from outside. Oh, God, can you imagine listening to one of those speeches? But I tell you something, when Fidel first got ill and stood back and Raul took over, people complained. They said, we miss that. We miss that. Fidel used to say, here are all our problems and here are the options that we have. And, this is the scenario we're in. And it gave people the knowledge, the perspective, the context, and it urged them, In that protest I talked about in 1994, the protests in Havana in response to appalling conditions after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, GDP fell 35%. It was called a riot on the Malecon. Fidel Castro went down there as soon as he heard. Same Miguel Díaz-Canel did the same on the 11th of July. But he went down there and stood on his Jeep and he gave a talk to people. And you could see there's footage. I'm telling you because there's footage. I'm not making it up. And you can see the tension when he gets here. And then by the end of his speech, he said, why are we in this situation? Because the imperialists are trying to crush us because we have nothing. And what does a cowardly people do? They give up. And what does a sovereign, brave people, and by the end of the speech, the crowd is cheering. They've turned from rioters into, revolutionaries once again. So that is an element we have to recognize. And Raul Castro didn't do that. He said right at the beginning, I'm not Fidel Castro, and I'm not, going to give long speeches or anything like that. So, but he did do something else we saw a lot of, which was, they'd had this before. I don't want to pretend this was under Raul only, but national debate and consultation, a massive series of national debates and consultations under this Raul period, 10-year period. 2008, he's formally elected as president. Before he was standing in. Now this, in my, and it's in my explanation in the book, is essential but ignored in most commentary. The level of engagement by the population in evaluating, critiquing, amending policy changes and proposed reforms through their representative channels, through public forums, through national consultations and referenda. And this is especially in the post-Soviet era. I'll give you an example. Post-Soviet era, terrible economic situation. What are we going to do? The National Assembly meets. Economists start proposing to tax workers. And this is interrupted by Fidel Castro. Apparently unusual, if you believe that. So he interrupts the proceedings, said, no, we cannot take this decision because they haven't had tax in Cuba since the revolution, right? We can't take this decision. We can't have economists making these decisions, right? We need to hear what the people think. So they suspended the assembly and launched a national consultation in which the trade unions were, organized these discussions. And the message, they reconvened, I think it was 6 months later, the message was no taxation. And they didn't. They've subsequently, as they have introduced more self-employment, those people are taxed and they have it, different ways, but it's all been subject to consultation. So Raul Castro launches the first consultation in 2007. He does the first time he comes out instead of Fidel Castro to do the 26th of July speech. That's their sort of National Revolution Day. And he starts by saying, I've traveled down from Havana on the road, the central highways. Cuba's a long, thin island, one main road. And I saw this beautiful countryside. And it's full of marabou. Marabou is this weed that somehow comes from North Africa and it has deep roots and it's taken over the land. In other words, we're not producing anything. We're spending billions every year importing, trying to, get around the US blockade and all the rest of it. So his first speech is a complete criticism, a critique. And it sparked such a debate, I was in Cuba and it was incredible. Everyone was talking about it. So they decided we'll create forums, we'll get people's view. And that's how this process started. Okay, so 6 major national consultations in 10 years and other ones in different sectors. So a new labour law was discussed just in the trade unions and so on. I'll give you an example. In 2011, they had 3 months of national debate on the Cuban Communist Party's document called the Draft Guidelines of the Economic and Social Policy of the Party and the Revolution. And that was informed by those consultations that they had after Raul's speech in 2007 and also in 2009. In this consultation, so some people will participate twice. They'll participate in their neighbourhood street committee and then their workplace. But here are the statistics. A population of 11.2 million people. A lot of them are elderly or children, and people are in hospital or in prison and so on. Although I'm not sure. I think prisoners may have been organised to debate. But 8.9 million people participated in these debates. The Communist Party membership at that time is 800,000. So this is a Communist Party document being discussed well beyond the boundaries of membership of the Communist Party. 3 million opinions were anonymously registered. They're literally taken down. I remember my friend said, because it's anonymous, who said, well, my name is so-and-so and I live at this address and you can take down that this is my view. And people really let loose on what they thought. And And they analysed all of these, categorised them into 780,000 recommendations. And as a consequence of them, 68% of the draft guidelines were actually changed. So it's not a sort of, what do you call it, like a public relations, yeah. Okay, and subsequently there was a document that wasn't for national consultation, it was for academics, experts and economists and so on and so forth. The conceptualization of Cuban socialism, first time they've ever done that, and a national plan. And the conceptualization document was 98% of it was changed after consultation. Right. So right now in Cuba, and I'm going to go there in a few weeks, so I'll see it for myself. There are these sorts of national debates about a new family code. Yeah. So the new family code is going to be extremely progressive, and it's a battle in Cuba because they tried to introduce with their new constitution to legalize same-sex marriage. Now they already have free transgender operations, they have a transgender representative in the National Assembly, but there is opposition. The evangelical church is openly organizing against the idea of same-sex marriage. So they took that in the constitution, they said like families are broad and diverse and marriages between two people instead of marriages between a man and a woman. But now they want to pass the family code. And I was talking to Anna about this. They could just make it law, but it doesn't solve it doesn't win the cultural and ideological battle to get the population to actually recognize these rights. So they are doing it the hard way and the long way because they want to win an ideological battle that everyone is equal and families can take any shape and form, you know? So this is really interesting. Okay. I'm going to say something, as I said, about class and privilege. So a brief snapshot from Cuba pre-revolution. I mean, this is a rural Cuba typical picture. And underneath I've got, statistics from rural Cuba. This is statistics taken not from, from the Catholic Association, did a report. And then there's also a report from 1951 US Business Report and an Investment in Cuba report, 1956. I can't remember exactly which date which one is. But 3% of rural Cubans owned land, 3%. So who owned the land? The sugar owners, not all, but largely from the United States, yeah? Huge, big mass landownings. 4% ate meat, 1% ate fish in an island surrounded by the ocean. 3% ate bread, 11% had milk after weaning, 20% ate eggs. Eggs, I mean, you'd think, a plot of land, you have a chicken and eat eggs, right? 20%. 2% had running water, 9% had electricity, yeah? And so 75% of rural dwellings were wooden huts like this. So, think about the infrastructural challenges when the revolution takes over. On a program of free education, free healthcare, you need to build roads. You need to get electricity to the countryside before you can have a rural clinic. Yeah? Incredible. And yet, as I said, Batista's packed up the suitcases, so have his cronies with the money, and off they've gone. So incredible, immense challenges. So, but, other economists will tell you, Cuba had among the highest GDP per capita income in Latin America. And it's true, it did. GDP, what are we measuring here? Havana was going under a consumer boom. 80% of imports went to the elite in Cuba, right? So, I think the image, Havana, 1950s, brothels, casinos, US business people on their holidays and so on. This report from the US Department of Commerce in 1956 says, the spectre of unemployment affects all thinking on labor and manpower problems in Cuba. Cuba has been fortunate that chronic unemployment has not created a more critical situation. Well, this was less than 3 years before the revolution, yeah? The Catholic University Association wrote this report. Havana is living in extraordinary prosperity, while in rural areas, especially wage workers, are living in unbelievably stagnant, miserable and desperate conditions. 35% of the working population were unemployed. it's inherent, it's structural. You have a sugar harvest that employs 500,000 people for 3 to 4 months of the year. And afterwards is known in Cuba as El Tiempo Muerto, the dead season, because there is hardly, they're scrapping around to find a way to survive. Very little or no social insurance, medicine, and so on. Very difficult. The average annual income was $91, illiteracy 24%. I mean, that's complete illiteracy. Another third of the people have 3 years education, so functionally illiterate. Infant mortality 60 per thousand. Today it's better than the United States by quite a bit, better than Britain. It's gone under 4 per thousand. Okay, so the first government after the revolution, and this is important because it was a multi-class revolution against dictatorship, yeah? A mass revolution. The first government are what are called liberal bourgeois. They were politicians or economists before in the system, but they soon leave because actually power in some ways isn't with the new government, it's with the rebel army, which is, headed by Fidel Castro, and it's the agrarian reform. And they leave and they take with, they're followed in the next few years by 1 million professionals. The population of Cuba is about 5.5 to 6 million. You're talking about a huge proportion of the population. Who are they? They are the people who run Cuba, and they take their expertise with them, right? And there's a lot in my first book about these, these barely literate people who have been, this guy who's a taxi driver in Havana, and he's put in charge of the Bacardi Corporation when it's nationalized. And he's just, like, what do I do? It's an incredible process of learning by doing that. This becomes the slogans. Sobre la marcha, you learn as you do. Okay, so revolutionaries, workers and peasants take over. So they dismantle the old state apparatus. They create a new one in parallel. Doesn't mean that all rich people go, not at all. Some wealthy individuals stay, and there's also some individual private property rights retained, right? But capitalist class interests are suppressed, and pro-capitalist parties are not permitted, and that's up till today. Of course, there are many. There are dozens of them. They're funded through US democracy promotion programs. Most of them have a handful of members. Most of the members are members of several. And they go with this concept of one united party of the revolution. Initially, it's called the Organization of Revolutionary Integration because there's actually lots of people don't know, there's 3 revolutionary armed movements that are part of the revolution. There's the Fidel Castro one, but there's the student one, and then there's the Cuban Communist Party, which really collaborates in the last year or so. Then it's dismantled for certain problems. There's sectarianism. The Communist people associated with the old Communist Party are trying to, just get their people in power and so on. It becomes the Party of the United Socialist Revolution. And finally, 1965, you have the Cuban Communist Party as it is today. So the supporters of Cuba claim that this is in the anti-imperialist, pro-independence tradition of national independence hero Jose Marti, who argued for one united party of all Cubans fighting for independence, the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He set it up, right? So they're saying it's in that tradition. Critics claim, of course, this is a dictatorship. So remember, there is one party. I mean, you also have the youth wing and so on. But the party doesn't stand in elections. So it's something to get your head around. 1976 Constitution, Article 1. Cuba is a socialist state of workers, independent and sovereign, organized with all and for the good of all, as a united democratic republic for the enjoyment of political freedom, social justice, individual and collective welfare and human solidarity. And that's amended slightly in 1919. I just want to read this quote from Che Guevara in relation to what I was talking about, the bourgeois class, the wealthy leaving. He said, "It would be ridiculous to think that workers from a sugarcane cooperative would leave the country. Those who had nothing before, whose children are sure to be studying, it's impossible to think that an honest member of the working class would leave." Okay, so revolutionary Cuba, worker state. Is it a worker state? What does that mean? Cuba has, and I think this might be relevant for some of you who have the expertise on how this worked in other socialist countries. There is a separation between the state or the government as an administrative apparatus and the Cuban Communist Party, which is seen as the ideological motor. And this is revisited. Raul Castro recently, and I think Miguel Diaz-Canel has talked about, we need to maintain that separation. Yeah, the Communist Party shouldn't be running the government or admin, right? It should be focusing on the politics and ideology. And this is, I think, different from the USSR and socialist bloc, but you'll tell us. Membership of the CCP, the Cuban Communist Party, is strict. It's hard to become a member. You have to be proposed. You have to be subject to a 10-year retrospective investigation. They go and talk to your neighbours and your work colleagues. So it's not, my understanding is in the USSR, anyone could be a member. So if you weren't, why weren't you? Yeah, it's a different system. It is supposed to be set up so that only the most hardworking and committed are members, right? That's the idea. Obviously, you have a central plan. The economy is organized to meet the needs of the whole population, which is a question of the democratization of resources and opportunity, if we're thinking about democracy in that material perspective, and not the pursuit of private profit. Investment in social welfare, removing financial barriers to access, education, health, housing, art, culture, sport. So these things are either free or highly subsidized. You have the system of people's power, which I've explained, and the organizations of the masses. You also have 19 independent trade unions. And this is an interesting label, independent, because they are financially autonomous and organizationally autonomous, but they are not independent from the state in the broader sense, in the way that the United States tries to create when it funds independent trade unions, right? So we can question that. And they have leverage over policy. I gave an example earlier of before. And in every workplace has production assemblies where the workers, argue and set their expectations for conditions, pay, and so on. Okay, obstacles. Economic liberalization that Cuba has had to undergo, particularly from the 1990s to survive the special period, leads to differential access to wealth, which leads to differential access to consumption and a growth of inequality. This is partly through remittances. So if you think about the first waves of Cubans who left, the politically motivated ones, they're mainly white. Yeah. And they go and get powerful, wealthy positions in the United States. They have more money to send back. The generations, the waves of migration subsequent probably to the 1970s are basically economic migrants. And, when Black Cubans leave and go to the United States, they're subject to the institutional racism of the United States. So there's less money being sent back. And that perpetuates historically rooted race and class inequalities. When legalizing the dollar, which was a step they took very reluctantly in 1993, Fidel Castro warned of emerging inequalities as those in receipt of remittances would, as he said, enjoy privileges that the rest do not have, something we're not used to. So again, talking, telling people what to expect, saying why it's necessary, recognizing it will be detrimental. And in 2003, in this book, that's why I got this picture, the interviews with Ignacio Ramonet, Fidel Castro said, building a new society is much harder than it might appear. The parents' educational level, even after we've made the revolution, continues to have a tremendous influence on the children's later outcomes. And they were in a period they'd initiated, there's a chapter in my book called The Battle of Ideas, right, which was partly about a cultural revolution and an educational revolution, and dealing with thousands of young people outside education and employment. It was just a fascinating experiment. So, and then the big challenge all the way through up till today and going on, and I'm sure this will be increasingly so as we go into the future, how to keep people engaged when resources are scarce and decisions can't be implemented or demands met. So people are elected to represent their community and they say, we've got a problem with sewage at the end of the street and we're all demanding it's fixed. But then you're told by the municipal authorities, there's no money, there's no budget. So then people say, well, what's the point? What's the point of participating and making these demands? So that is a big challenge. That's about resources. Okay, I had a set of lectures, slides about racism and discrimination and what's been achieved in each area, gender equality, but I've already been speaking for an hour. So I think I should...
We still...
Please do.
Yeah?
Why not?
Okay, I'll try and do it a little bit quicker. Okay, racism and discrimination. So Cuba is colonized by Spain, and you have multiple different categories and racial categories and labels, which all have legal and social consequences. Yeah, I'm not going to have time to explain. Peninsulares are Spanish-born colonial representatives. Creoles can be Cuban-born, but still white representatives of the colonial state, and there's conflict between them for power and so on. You have black people who are from African descent, or slaves originally, or free blacks as they were called. Chinese who are brought in as indentured when slavery is prohibited. Mestizo or mixed or mulatto, they use the term in Cuba. Other Europeans, I mean, there's Eastern Europeans there. One of the people who worked closest with Che was a Jewish, Polish, migrants that had ended up in Cuba. So slavery is not abolished in Cuba till 1886. It's very late. And by that point, 1 million Africans had been forcefully taken to Cuba as slaves. 1 million. Do you know that's much more than were taken to the United States? It's incredible if you think about the size, right? In the 19th century, you had independence movements which sought to unite all Cubans of every color. And, the final independence movement was launched when a slave owner declared that his slaves were free, but please come and fight with me for independence, right? So this is really interesting. I've just read, I recommend a fascinating book by Ada Ferrer, Insurgent Cuba, who talks about some of the complexities, because we're all Cubans, regardless of color or race, but in some ways it obscured persistent racism and classism as well, I would say. You had an uprising in 1912 by Black Cubans, which was violently suppressed. Estimates are 3,000 were killed. In this period known as the pseudo-republic in Cuba, a semi-colony, when the United States has the Platt Amendment, it intervenes regularly. Essentially, racist discrimination is rife and institutionalized. So you have black beaches, white-only beaches, white-only buses, and so on, right? And it's very interesting because Batista is not white, he's mixed. But he is also not able to go to some of the elite clubs and whatever, right? And there's a class basis to racism, of course, yeah? The Constitution, the first Constitution of 1976, celebrates all of the forms of resistance. It's very important to point out indigenous resistance to Spanish colonialism, slaves and black African resistance to slavery, but also sometimes they fought together. The Constitution celebrates the Indians who preferred extermination to submission, the slaves who rebelled against their masters, those who awoke the national consciousness and ardent Cuban desire for an independent homeland and liberty. And you cannot understand Cuban socialism or development post-59 if you don't understand the crux, the heart of it is the struggle for independence, for sovereignty and social justice. And that is the vital form of the expression of their socialism. Okay, so race and discrimination post-59, no separate organisation was set up for black people, which is an interesting decision and links to this concept of cubanidad. We don't want to identify differences, we want to identify similarities. Unlike women had their own organisation established, as I said. So, the non-white population respectively benefits relatively more because they are starting from a worse starting point in terms of state investment in welfare, democratization of opportunities and access is free and universal. Institutional racism is eliminated, but undoubtedly prejudice persists at individual level. And there is a big discussion and debate about the extent to which the state hides this by not talking about it or acknowledges it. But as we'll see, that has changed. Economic liberalization and remittances, as I said already, exacerbate historically rooted racial and class inequalities. So in contemporary Cuba, according to the census, again, people are self-identifying, and there's a legacy of why people would prefer to self-identify as white when they could be mixed. 65% are white, 25% mixed, 10% black. So many people say the black population or the non-white population is much higher. Okay. In the National Assembly, I gave that statistic already, 40.6%. Since 2013, this guy, just going to use the chance for the little light there. He is Esteban Lasso, since 2013, been the president of the National Assembly, and previously was the vice president of the Council of State. This is really important development. In 2019, the Council of Ministers established a new national program against racism and discrimination. So it really admitted in a way that they haven't dealt with the issue of prejudice, racism as individual prejudice. And that's headed by the President of the Republic, Miguel Díaz-Canel. It's a recognition that racism persists. Okay, gender inequality pre-revolution. So again, 1953 census, there's 1.74 million women of working age, 14% work all year, 14%. 700,000 are unemployed or underemployed, 83% work less than 10 weeks a year. 70% of those who work are domestic servants. Yeah? 77 unpaid, thousands doing unpaid work for families. There's an estimated 100,000 prostitutes in Havana. So remember what I said, it's the casinos and brothels, it's a weekend holiday place for US people. Abortion is illegal. Education is difficult for women to access. Now, the Revolution of 33 did formally give women the right to vote, but it wasn't enacted. The 1940s Constitution was prohibited gender discrimination and said equal pay for equal work, but again, it was not enacted. And this is an advert from the period, as you can see. Okay, so Vilma Espin, I mentioned her before. She was one of the leading revolutionary women in the movement of 26 July, guerrilla fighter and so on, Comandante. I'm not sure if she was a Comandante, actually. She set up the Federation of Cuban Women in 1960. I should say she was also, because they met in the guerrilla struggle, married Raul Castro. It has today 3 million members. 85% of women in Cuba are in the FMC. As traditional carers, again, women benefited from the introduction of public health care. The public healthcare system was initially set up through primary care to prioritize maternity and child health and education. So you have this important, the year before the Constitution, 1975, the Family Code, it criminalizes discrimination and makes it necessary to have a shared responsibility for, it actually says, when you get married, the vows that you take say you'll share responsibility for domestic work, political work, careers, revolutionary work. So that's on paper. In 2022, we've got the new Family Code, which is under consultation. There is free access and readily accessible to abortion, family planning, divorce is very easy in Cuba. Childcare, education enrollment, equal pay for equal work as a reality. During the special period, of course, as with any experience of austerity, women were hardest hit because there is still a double burden, right? Women are coming home from work and trying to come up with some magic to put food on the table, to wash clothes when there's a blackout. Electricity was shut off for 12 hours at a time. There's no soap and so on. Very, very tough. And there was a rise to prostitution as they turned more to tourism. All of these things openly recognised and discussed in national discourse. Post 2000, we had the Battle of Ideas, which I mentioned, and this is a picture from social workers, which I took on May Day. I can't remember what year, 2000, 2001. As you can see, mostly women and non-white Cubans. And 72% of these social workers who played this sort of vanguard, rejuvenating role in the revolution were women, and they were accessing education and training opportunities. Lots of them were mothers as well, because they had this education revolution. So they opened universities in every municipality, so people could be carers and get degrees. Okay, contemporary Cuba. Here's a snapshot. Women represent 68% of university graduates, 81% of medical students, 66% of the labor force, 60% of professionals, 66% of Cuban science and technology professionals, 50% of engineers. I mean, in Britain, I think it's 11% of engineers, 53% of the National Assembly, as I said, 42% of the Central Committee. Women as key government ministers in seven key government ministries, and provincial heads in 8 out of 14. However, as I said, the traditional domestic gender division remains, and women face the double burden of work and domestic duty. And machismo undoubtedly exists. Sexist views persist in individuals, not institutions. Similar to the question of racism. Now, this text is really small, but basically, I recommend this book, Cuba's Gay Revolution by Emily Kirk. And all I've got here is tracking from, the pre-revolution. Homosexuality was illegal. This is a question of sexual and gender diversity. Prostitution was associated with crime and US tourism, or the US military being stationed in Cuba. Homophobic traditions come to Cuba from Spanish colonialism, Catholicism, and so on, but also from US domination and the culture of machismo. So this continues the association post-revolution. Homosexuality is associated with prostitution and imperialism, and it's seen as antithetical to the new man of, Cuban socialism. And then Cuba becomes increasingly under Soviet influence, the cultural influence and social influence as well in the 1970s. And the Soviet Union is essentially homophobic. So that does impact Cuba. It becomes challenged in Cuba. Oh, yeah. So they have this thing called the Military Units to Aid Production, UMAP camps. And these are agricultural labor camps, which are set up for people who can't or won't join the compulsory military service. Now, it's interesting that discourse and history records them as camps for gay people, but actually only 9% of the people in these camps were homosexuals. And what happened was there was an incident when a group of artists, homosexual artists, were sent. And there was uproar by another organisation, sort of the masses, not really, is the Writers and Artists Union. And they complained. And then the camps were visited by Cuban leadership, including Fidel Castro, and they were shut down. But, it's still seen as camps for gay people, which is not historically correct, but I think it is a legacy that the Cubans are openly dealing with now. So this gets combated. 1975, they set up a commission to look at the question. By 79, they have the decriminalization of homosexuality. 79. So to put that in context, in 2003, the US federal government decriminalized homosexuality. And until 1990, the World Health Organization classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. Till 1990. Most of us were born by then. It's quite incredible. So they set up in 1979 as part of this commission, the National Working Group for Sex Education, and it's run by the Women's Federation. And then that becomes, I'll tell you. So HIV, obviously AIDS, is a global phenomenon in the 1980s, and the Cuban response is consistent with their infectious diseases controls, which we've seen with COVID. They did quarantine, so people who were diagnosed went into sanatoriums, and this got criticized from outside. But there was a revision of it by 94. They were allowed to stay or leave. Lots chose to stay because they got high quality healthcare and so on. But the prevalence of HIV in Cuba is one of the lowest in the world. And undoubtedly it's related to their response. And they now have medicines produced by their biotech sector that have converted AIDS or HIV into a chronic disease rather than a deadly disease. Okay, so, and in the 1990s, the Women's Federation and the Ministry of Health start to promote sexual health courses, normalizing sexual diversity and countering homophobia. And this is the new family code is an important step. Okay, so then you have this really key thing here is the National Centre for Sex Education. If I can get my little red dot right. CENISEX. This has become, in some senses, world leading in combating discrimination and for the rights of LGBT and plus. And transgender and so on. And it's led by Mariela Castro, who is the daughter of both Raul Castro and Vilma Espin, who set up the FMC. Okay. So the Ministry of Culture starts to invest in films, because they understand you have to have a cultural and ideological change, a change in consciousness. And Fidel Castro gives an important interview in 1992, and he says, "I am absolutely opposed to any form of repression, contempt, scorn, discrimination with regard to homosexuals." And that is a signal. I talked about his moral authority. This is no longer accepted in any shape or form, right? So you have, as a product of the ministry's investment, Fresa Chocolate, Strawberries and Chocolate, very famous film. It gets nominated for an Oscar. And then CENISEX begins to focus on the rights of transgender people from 2008. They've had free gender alignment surgery, pride marches every year, and so on. A transgender woman was elected to a municipal assembly in 2012, and then the National Assembly voted to legalise same-sex marriage. It hasn't yet been formalised. It's part of the new family code. Okay, this is Mariela Castro, by the way, at the front of this march with the hat. Okay, conclusions. That was much longer than I intended. Okay, so wrapping it up really. In 1950s revolutionary movement against the Batista dictatorship, which was, propped up by the United States and seen very much in that way, was a multi-class mass movement. Participation after 59 continued in the form of political agitation and mobilization, constant mass rallies and stuff, but also these organizations of the masses which were set up on local popular councils. This was all institutionalized in 1976 with the new constitution, the new socialist constitution, and a national system of people's power with 3 levels of representation. It's now 2. Just to clarify, they've eliminated the provincial assemblies because they were seen as creating conflicting layers, right? They are, I'll get to that in a minute actually. So it's not a party system and it's not a multi-party system, right? I hope I've made that clear, like the distinction, yeah? It has a party, one party, but not a party system. The key tenets are reiterate non-party elections, delegates not paid, accountability, delegates must render account. The Cuban system has evolved and changed. They are constantly critiquing. They are, always sort of conferences, debates, and so on. And this process continues, along with the constant need to revitalize participation among youth. One of the reactions to the 11th of July protests last summer has been that the president and the president of the street committees have gone to first to the neighborhoods where the protests were most violent. And they have talked to the mass organizations which have been dormant because of COVID. They were very strict in epidemiological terms, no gatherings and so on. And they are attempting to revitalize them, right? So that's been their response. And Cuba in general is going through the creation of a new development model, which is which means increased decentralization of budgets and decision making to the municipalities. And this is linked to the Tarea Vida Life Task, the state plan to combat climate change, which, as Anna mentioned, I helped to co-produce a documentary about last summer. So to combat climate change in your locality, you need to give budgets and decision making to local people. So there's a whole process of decentralization. So the political system, the system of democracy and participation is undergoing a deepening and an expansion process at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen, for this very rich and insightful lecture, and also for all the questions. I guess there are many more questions in the audience, or maybe from those on Zoom. Tanya, please.
Thank you so much, Helen, for this, and I'm totally delighted that we have an opportunity to have you here. Thank you guys from the Institute for making this possible. I think you are doing great work to all of us, also in this area, because sometimes, and I'm sure that you feel that on your skin as well, it's not easy to speak of a system, of a country, of a society that so much differs from what we have today as basically being presented as having no alternative, which is liberal democracy. And I just came back basically from Cuba maybe a week ago, and my first question for you would be, I want to hear more of your personal and thoughts about July 11 and its consequences, because this time of Cuba I could really see a change that, and people openly speak about that with a lot of concern, that this time, although of course liberal idea is already for 50 years that Cuban socialism will collapse any moment. That's like, we always meet that, like, let's go there before this disappears. It's not how people in Cuba see their own reality, but I would say the present moment there is an internal division, maybe for the first time, but they also say that to themselves, that for the first time in revolutionary history, there are frictions within Cuban society. I'm not sure whether these are just generational frictions, and my related question for you would be, what do you think about the role, how social media, the first place, impact developments and will impact developments on Cuba? Because obviously, and for me it was very clear this time, even I got immediately the local card with the internet, so I had internet all the time. I didn't like it, I more liked being cut for a couple of weeks before.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
But now it's obviously much more accessible,
Yeah.
and has an impact also on political life. And my other question, I know now it's not the topic of this, but I know it's your topic. I read your PhD. You didn't tell us about, like you presented all of the models of political life, but we didn't hear a lot about Cuban economic model. Could you very briefly just say something about that?
Wow, I'm going to have to speak for another hour, I think, to answer those questions. I mean, I mentioned I was in Cuba on the 11th of July. Okay, I've got so much, I have written about it, and I can send that to you if you give me your email. But I've got lots to say. Context, right? Context is important. For the Trump administration came in 2017, did nothing for about 6 months, and then started to pass measures to increase sanctions against Cuba. Now, this is not an excuse. Yeah, the Trump administration took the blockade, embargo, sanctions to unprecedented levels, beyond Reagan, Bush, the most right-wing neoliberal US presidents. And it has had a devastating impact on daily life. You've seen it, right? I mean, I live in a Cuban home. I don't know whether, but they're up at 4:30 in the morning to get into queues for basic goods, for food and medicine. And then, I mean, this was from 2019. So we're talking about 3 years of this now.
And COVID in between.
So I was getting there. So it was already bad. It's worth saying this. This is pre-COVID. In about May 2019, the Trump administration announced that it would fine any shipping company taking oil to Cuba, to energy to Cuba, food, medicines to Cuba. So they literally a tanker was about to pull into Havana and said, we can't stop. because it's not worth it for them, for the fines that they'll get through the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, the US Treasury. So the situation was already bad, and then COVID. And they responded because they have an incredible history of epidemiological controls, disease response, disaster control, and so on. And they closed the borders. And of course, tourism is the second biggest earner for Cuba. And GDP plummeted within just over a year, 13%. Think about that. We talk about 35% in the special period. That's over 3 years. So you're on the same track as the kind of collapse from the special period, which I always say is associated with a war or famine, or we can say pandemic now, yeah? So devastating circumstances. Plus, with COVID, not only did they close the borders and lose income, they then had to dedicate all of their resources to combating the disease, because they had like medicalized, hospitalized care for everyone. So even if you were asymptomatic, you were in a hospital being fed, and it put a massive strain on their electricity supply. So this all matters because a couple of things. One, when the 11th of July protests happen, they happen first in San Antonio de los Baños. Why do they happen? In response to electricity blackout. Because they can't get spare parts for their electricity generators, or they can't get the specific fuel for that generator because, and it's interesting, Miguel Diaz-Canao is an electrical engineer, and he was on television the day after explaining in great detail, like the problems they have when their markets are closed, right? 2 days before Trump left, very vindictively, he put Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And what that means is automatically, every bank in the world puts Cuba on the high risk category, and they will not carry out transactions because they're terrified. I mean, the fines they've been having, even under Obama, rapprochement, we want to improve relations, but they were still fining European and international banks, never mind US, in the billions. I mean, before rapprochement, there were 14 point something billion of fines against European banks, right? So the context is the economic situation is terrible. Blackouts, electricity cutouts, are associated with the special period, and it creates a lot of social discontent. A month before the protest, I'd written an economic and political update on the situation in Cuba, and I said it is incredibly hard. And so far, the Cubans have shown incredible forbearance, but we should not be surprised if there are explosions of social protests. And there was, right? And, it was just shocking for Cuba. But as I said, that day in Latin America, there were like really violent protests all over. What was happening in the United States the whole of that summer? Black Lives Matters. I mean, people were killing each other on the street, right? So we know all that, right? Then the other issue you raise is really important about social media. So the Cubans expanded social media. I mean, we were always told, Cuba doesn't allow access to the internet, it's a total lie. There are 30 something optic fiber cables that pass Cuba in the Caribbean, and it can't access them because of US blockade, right? So actually the Cubans have had to spend masses of extra money. They've had to do deals with third parties to try and get internet into the country. So from 2018, it's expanded and people are getting it on their phones, right? So what happens is during COVID, you have this terrible daily grind, struggle for basic goods. At the same time, then you have panic because they've never seen their public healthcare system overwhelmed. And, that happens in Matanzas, where the protests were particularly violent. Yeah. We were in Britain, I think, the fourth surge, the fourth time we'd heard that our hospitals were in emergency situation, but the Cubans had never seen it. And then you have workplaces are closed, universities, schools are closed. So where are people getting their sort of debating and, this process that is so much part of their daily lives has been shut down. And so they're just tuning into social media. And at the same time, the US Congress every year, this is what's overt, approves a budget of $20 million for what they call democracy promotion programs, right? And a lot of that is going towards the internet. See, they concluded from the Arab Spring that YouTube, Google, Facebook can create a revolution. and they have invested millions in. So they had this Twitter handle, yeah? You know about this, I'm sure, right? SOS Cuba. It's launched actually, a Spanish media analyst got to the bottom of it. It's launched in Miami 2 days before. And there are Twitter accounts that the geostrategic location has been changed to make them look like they're in Cuba. And they're retweeting stuff, 5 retweets a second. I mean, the foreign relations minister of Cuba stood up in a press conference. He said to the journalist, "Go on, I challenge you, try it." I mean, they're robots and troll farms and all the rest of it. So you've got that sort of confluence of all of those things like a perfect storm, and you have these protests. Now, I travelled through Havana on that day because I was leaving the quarantine hotel. I arrived in Cuba, I had to spend 5 days in quarantine, and I didn't see anything about the protests. So what does that tell you? First of all, they weren't everywhere. They were in pockets, yeah? And I'm not disputing that it was a big shock for Cuba. It was unprecedented. It was a lot of people for Cuba, because normally dissidents, when they mobilize, get 2 or 3 people, and they only go if they're paid $20, you know? And so this happened. I didn't see it, so it wasn't everywhere. I got to my Cuban home and I put the television on because for once England was in the final of the European Football Championship. So I was like, don't talk to me, I'm just waiting. And at half-time, the interval, the program was interrupted by a speech by the president who told the Cuban public what was happening. And that's when he said, the streets belong to the revolutionaries. And at that point, thousands of Cubans, tens of thousands of Cubans around the country went out onto the street. And what was fascinating, the internet was cut off, right? What was fascinating is when my internet came back on and lots of people, I mean, millions of people in Cuba were downloading VPNs, which I subsequently found out, like the main one they were using was set up by the CIA and funded by the Republicans, you know, and it's a tool for part of these programs. Anyway, so when my internet was reconnected, I was getting messages from people going, "Are you safe? Are you okay?" Because the portrayal of the protests was insane. I mean, I've seen media manipulation, but this was in a different category. Like, just even things like they showed an image, because in Egypt, there's a Malakon, you know, a seawall that curves. And they showed tens of thousands of people on a Malakon saying, "This is Cuba happening now." And they had Egyptian flags. If you zoomed in, you can see that. I mean, it was crazy. They showed an image from the May Day before COVID with 1 million people in Havana and said, "This is now." And it was a total manipulation. Then pictures of people, you know, kids who've been shot, and then they were from, you know, wherever they were from, right? Somewhere else in Latin America. And you know, the media analysts had to do a lot of work unpicking. Did you want to? No. So social media, decisive. They're going to have to be in that battle. I've spoken to a Cuban journalist and I said, you know, what's the attitude? She said, a lot of the old guard wanted to resist opening up, but it's there. The internet is there, and we're just going to have to be in that battle, right? And we're just going to have to, you know, always raise consciousness and so on. I'm trying to move on to the other parts of your question. In relation to the impact has been fascinating. I mentioned that Miguel Diaz-Canel and Gerardo Hernandez, who some of you will have heard of the Cuban Five. The Five, they were Cubans who went to Miami to infiltrate. Yeah, there's a movie. There's 2 actually now. There's the new one that's still doing the round. I know the producers. It's called Castros Spies. It's better than the Netflix one, which is called the WASP network, I think. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so these were 5 Cubans who infiltrated right-wing groups, terrorist groups in Miami that were making plots against Cuba in order to provide information to prevent those terrorist, you know, deaths happening. And the Cuban government presented the information to the US government, which responded by arresting the Cubans and putting them in prison. One of them had 2 life sentences. This man, Gerardo Hernandez, he was released with rapprochement when Obama announced rapprochement. They released him. He would never have seen the light of day. And now he is the president of the Cuban street committees, and he's doing an amazing job. Every day, if you follow him on Facebook, he's in a different barrio a different neighborhood and he's talking to people and mobilizing people. So in some ways, what happened on the 11th of July, and to put it in context, it was about 2-3 hours of violent protest. It horrified, ordinary Cubans, whatever that means. But, like the Cubans that I know who aren't militants or whatever, they were like one of the protests, these essentially delinquents attacked a children's hospital. And that's how people, they are just disgusted because, the sanctity of children in Cuba and healthcare and so on. So in some ways it's been useful for the Cuban government and democratic system because it knew it had a backlog of socio-economic problems to deal with. Marginalized communities, not marginalized, I have had a discussion with Cuban. When you say marginalized, even though the Cubans use the term, you think of the poor barrios of, Brazil or something. We're not talking about that. We're still talking about people who live in homes, who have access to free healthcare and education, but maybe they're not in work or employment or, anyway. So there is an issue, right? There is a falling out of engagement. There's a growing consumerist culture, particularly among young people, which is utterly fed by social media.
Exactly, and also change in cultural communication in politics. When I was there, the biggest issue was the way President's wife was treated in social media. She was highly insulted, people talking about her as being fat. And most of Cubans got very hurt and very confused about that because that was not the way you think on politics in Cuba. Yeah, they're catching up,
Yeah,
exactly.
They're catching up. And these are all challenges. So I can't reassure anyone who wants to hear that everything's going to be okay. Their battle lines have been drawn. And that's how I ended my article when I wrote about being there on the 11th of July. But the characteristic about Cuba and Cuban politics is they are openly articulating these problems in order to be able to confront them, which is so important. And I think distinct from a lot of other countries that have attempted to build socialism. And I just want to say the other thing, there are signs like a new protest was called for the 25th of November, then the 14th of November, and that was it was a washout. It didn't happen. And basically pro-government Cubans or pro-socialist took the opportunity to have street parties. And they had street parties outside the leader of this, he was an artist, he's supposed to be the leader of this movement. And he said, I'm not going to participate, but I'm going to walk along the street with a white rose. And actually his neighbors organized a party outside his house so he couldn't leave. And then he was, remember the context, it's for social media. That's what it's for. It doesn't matter if it's one person, it will be amplified beyond all reach that you could hope for if you have a protest about the environment or something, about government corruption in your country. One person, and they have the mass international media there. And so the Cubans went on the roof and dropped a banner in front of his window so he couldn't be seen. They will fight back, right? That is, and it may get more violent and it may be more confrontational. But what you don't have is a Cuban population that is prepared to let socialism collapse and the government fall and the revolution end without fighting back. And I remember talking to Orlando Borrego, who was Che's number 2 deputy, because obviously my first research was on that. And he was saying, we were talking about the importance of consciousness and Che's emphasis on consciousness. He saw socialism as a product of productivity plus consciousness. And he said, otherwise, how do you explain, in the Soviet Union collapse and all the socialist countries, and not a stone was thrown to defend the system. And I'm telling you, absolutely guarantee that it would be different in Cuba. And May Day was, sorry, I'm going on too long about one question. May Day was amazing. May Day was like, they hadn't had May Day since pre-COVID. And there were, 600,000, 700,000 in Havana, but also that they happen in all the local areas. And it was there was loads of US people there and, posting videos and pictures and people, international delegations. And it was a real sort of celebration. And in some ways what they're celebrating is we've survived. They've got through COVID in the sense that they are the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to have developed not one, but they actually have 5 potential, what they call candidate vaccines, 3 already being used. They're already being exported, and they can now open up their borders to tourism. So things are looking up. They've just had a terrible explosion at the Saragata Hotel, a new hotel. It was 4 years of repairs. Was going to open up for this new, optimistic period of reopening tourism. And 2 days before it was due to open or something like that, there was this terrible gas explosion. So they have had a really, really tough time. But I'll tell you something, as a colleague of mine said, Cubans wrote the rule book on resilience.
We have a question on Zoom. Yuquan Zhou writes, "Hello, Dr. Yaffe. Thank you for the brilliant lecture. Very exciting to hear an account on Cuba's political history that is free of mainstream Western cliches. I would like to ask a question. What is the role of Marxism in Cuban political discourse and process? Can one be an independent Marxist or socialist in Cuba?"
Okay, so I've not had that question before, so I haven't thought this through. I mean, Marxism, basic Marxist principles are integrated into the Cuban education system, but also like primary school books for the youngest kids, or maybe nursery school. They, I have seen this in a page like the Pioneers, the youth organization, has a slogan, "Seremos como el Che," we will be like Che. So what does it mean to be like Che? It means doing things for others, caring about the world. And it's all these sorts of values are integrated at the youngest levels. And there are, Marxism courses and stuff. But, I remember when I first turned up in Cuba, and I was kind of expecting people to be walking around in, the olive green military uniforms, reading, Marx, and they're not, right? I shouldn't use the word normal, but it is a country with people in it, yeah? And you have people who are really interested in Marxism and socialism and revolution. And then you have people who really don't give 2 hoots, as they say in English, yeah? And you have good people and bad people and generous people and greedy people and all the rest of it. So I'm not sure what you mean with your question about being an independent Marxist, because it presupposes a form of rigidity of a combining of thought within an institution, which I don't see in Cuba. As I said, there are, membership of the Communist Party is restricted and limited, and it's quite tough. And this guy I know, Jesus Garcia Pastor, sorry, Jesus, if you're listening. He has written loads of work on democracy, loads of work on social property relations, and produces work which, with teams, with other academics, which can, influence policy and so on. And he's very much a Marxist. He's incredible knowledge of, Marx, Lenin, and all the whole canon. And yet he says, I'm not in the Communist Party at the moment because I don't have time. And that you can't join the Communist Party just for your status. It takes a dedication. So is he an independent Marxist? I don't know what that means. If that's what you mean by an independent Marxist, then yes, you have many independent Marxists. And I'll tell you something very interesting. The new constitution of 2019 was going to eliminate something in the 76th revolution that said we are a socialist country en route to communism. And they took it out of the draft. And there was popular protest during the consultation, and it got put back. So that's really interesting, right? I don't know whether that's answered your question.
Just a short question, a little bit related to that the previous question. Did you ever have a similar lecture in the United States? And what was the response or the echo from the other side, especially if that was non-academic public?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I haven't. I have just done a virtual tour of the United States plus Vancouver, so North America. But most of the talks I did were about Cuba's state plan to combat climate change, or about Cuba's response to COVID-19 and their biotech sector in general. But interestingly, whatever you talk about, you always get a question to do with democracy and politics, and in where I spoke in universities, I mean, I had several students who would stand up and they were just like, everything I've ever heard about Cuba was negative. Like I don't really know what to do with this information now. So, you know, it does strike you, and hopefully, you know, I'll go back. But no, I do. I was telling Anna about this. I was at a weird conference in Canada years ago, women's leadership conference. I had no idea why I was there. It was like the corporate and intellectual elite, and then there was me. I guess I was the token lefty. I don't know. And I was at the time I was working in Venezuela with a vice ministry of the communal economy who were interested in Che's proposal for economic management, which I haven't been able to talk about today because it's too much. And I was discussing it with them, and then I went to this conference, and you know, I had like flip-flops because and it was all like suited and booted. And I was talking, they asked me to talk about the capitalist crisis because this was like 2013 or something. And I must have mentioned Cuba or something because someone stood up in the audience and they were like, from a former socialist country, I think Poland, you know, and speaking about their experience. And often people who have their experience of socialism in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union assume that Cuba must be the same. And actually it's very distinct. I just think that's worth pointing out. And she was saying, you know, when I wanted to travel abroad under socialism in Poland, I had to ask for permission for my passport and so on and so forth. And I was like, yeah, okay, yeah. So your movement was controlled. There was about 500 people in this room. Can you put your hand up if you're from the United States? Most of the people put their hands up. Keep your hand up if you've traveled to Cuba, Caribbean island, just neighboring. About 4 hands stayed up. I said, yeah, because you are not allowed to travel to Cuba. You have no freedom. You have to apply for a license. Yeah. So, you know, yes, there were restrictions, but there was also, so I think it's, you just have to do it. You have to challenge. That's why I started. I didn't know what the audience was going to be like today. You could all be people who had experienced socialism in Slovenia and thought it was terrible. And, you know, why was this person coming here talking about this? So that's really important to present that conceptual framework at the beginning and the historical context. You know, the way that socialism emerges in Cuba is very different as well.
Thank you.
Yuguang Joe just commented on your answer. Thanks a lot for the answer. Yes, the story about the Marxist prank indeed answered my question.
Okay.
And Ivan,
thank you very much for the presentation. Could you tell us a bit more about the role of the Communist Party in the political system, specifically its relations to the Council of State and the mass organizations which you discussed? So, do the memberships of the Council of State and Politburo intersect a lot or not really?
Yeah, okay.
Is the Central Committee a large organization?
Yeah.
Does it have specific departments responsible for different government agencies? And consequently, does it have specific departments which are responsible for the mass organizations? And how are the elections carried out in the sense that we have like one candidate for one seat only? So how is the nomination process working?
Okay, so those are different questions. And I have to say, I'm not an expert in the Cuban Communist Party. It's not something I've examined in close detail, but I can answer some of your questions. So in terms of the elections, you're saying, is it one seat? No, you cannot hold an election unless you have 2 or more candidates. You just have to keep proposing people until someone agrees. And if no one gets an overall majority, then you have to rerun the election. So no, it's a competitive election, yeah, without the material incentives. So that's that element. Secondly, how much overlap, I think you're asking, is there between the Cuban Communist Party and the government? Well, recently in the, the speeches by Raúl Castro, and I think if you go back, you'll see by Fidel or a leadership of the Communist Party, have expressed the concern that the number of members of government that were Communist Party members is very low. So they actually got it up to something like 20, someone on Zoom can correct me, 28% now of the National Assembly are members of the Communist Party. So it's not the overwhelming majority.
I was wondering about the Council of State, which is actually...
The Council of State, yeah, I imagine it would be much higher. Mm-hmm. I have no idea, but I imagine it would be much higher. But if you think about the process, the logic of the process, if it's a meritocracy and it's a worker state, and you want to put in leadership positions those who are most committed and the hardest working, then you are highly likely to have members of the Communist Party, if it is, as they try to maintain the character as a vanguard party and not a careerist entity where you join in order to get better jobs and so on. Right? There are accusations of that, but they also have an element. They have occasionally campaigns against corruption within the Communist Party. You're talking about pretty low level corruption. Maybe quite widespread, but very low level. And the Communist Party, and they still, certainly under Raúl Castro, have had much more of a zero tolerance policy on corruption for Communist Party members. It's seen as extremely bad. So I don't know the extent that answers your question. I'm not going to pretend I know the answer to what percent of the Council of State. I wouldn't be surprised if it was 100%. Yeah.
And what about the mass organizations? Are they guided by Communist Party members?
No. There may be, like, so when I showed you these, where are they? These things, right? You can sort of see this bit at the top, and it says all the organizations that they're members in. So they could be a member of 5 organizations. It could be a women's federation, their trade union, their street committee, the Communist Party, maybe or maybe not, the small farmer, whatever. So then they may be a member of the Communist Party and a local representative, but I'd have to look into the statistic. But there is no sense that the Communist Party is pulling the strings, behind that. And as I said, they've had an agenda to keep separate the functions of administration, the state, and the Communist Party, because they have a sense that it can create bad instructions and a lack of objectivity to scrutinize process. But I mean, I would recommend you look at I can send you some work by Jesus, the guy I just mentioned. But also there's some English language texts as well, which go in more detail. I don't know, I can't remember whether Raby's book has details of, it's quite old now, it's from 2010 or I don't know, whenever. But it might have some statistics on how many members of the street committees are also in the Communist Party. But it is a demand on your time, right? And no one is paying you for that. So it does limit the people who want to participate.
Yeah, thank you very much for your really refreshing lecture. I have a related question. It's about mass organizations, about mobilization and values.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how they managed to sustain this high level of mobilization throughout the decades, and how is this connected with the ideology and the Communist Party and with the revolutionary values. And how were they changing throughout the decades? And if they are still popular in a way, do they still mobilize? Are they still for nowadays globalized world of social media? How does that work? How people react to this?
Yeah, so in answering your question, I'm not sort of sure whether to go for like the snapshot where we are now, because the snapshot where we are now is uncharacteristic because, as I said, everything was shut down because of COVID. It started to open.
sustainable situation before.
Yeah. So, but what's
indicative?
indicative? It's open since the start of this year, right? With the population fully 96% fully vaccinated with a domestic vaccine. They were hit by Omicron, and the numbers, you can see the cases go up, but fatalities stayed at 1, 2, 3, 4. So their vaccine worked. So this has enabled them to reopen. And I think it's indicative that May Day was a massive mobilization, massive all over the country, and a celebratory. Were you there for May Day? No, you just after.
I was in April.
Oh, okay. And a sort of celebratory feel, as I said. But yeah, the mass organisation, I mean, they need revitalising. The street committees, for example, were set up. It was in 1960. Fidel Castro was doing a speech to thousands of people. And news came through of another act of sabotage, another bombing, and people had been killed. And, you know, it's quite hard to remember that this was a daily occurrence in the first years of the revolution. And he said something like, we really need committees to defend the revolution. And that's how the street committees came about. So their initial function was a surveillance function. And people used to organize controls because, you know, you had real terrorism being carried out. And they evolved away from that. So they do things like, you know, the day of the CDRs is the 27th of September, and they organise street parties. But then, you know, they might do, as I said, local football team, recycling campaigns to pick up metal, and, you know, anything, could be anything. So, and the CDRs organise these the debates and so on. So they haven't returned. I mean, I knew one person who carried on doing patrols all on his own in the CDR, but I don't think that function doesn't continue, but they still have a mobilizing capacity. And when it's a party, 100%, I mean, the whole neighborhood's out. So yeah, the Women's Federation, they're very active. They're 85% of the adult population are members. And, you know, they have this dynamic leadership as well. And yeah, I would say they are. I mean, someone would say not. So, Che, I mean, one of the things is the capacity of the revolution to reinvent itself, to rejuvenate itself. So I showed you this picture. The vanguard changes.
Well, the second opinion.
Yeah.
All right, here. Right, so I'll tell you a little bit more about these social workers, right? This is coming out of the 1990s, period of the special period, economic crisis, austerity. You had this layer of young people who they realised were outside work and employment, and they first started to investigate this because they were looking at prisons. Who are the young people in prisons? And they found that they were a tiny percent of them had parents that went to universities. More of them were black. So they then said, well, let's look at the neighborhoods they're from. And they did an investigation. They took university students, went with a survey to find out who these people were and what their situation was. And this coincides with, I don't know if you might not remember, but Elian Gonzalez, yeah? 6-year-old Cuban boy taken by his mother on a raft, very, you know, dodgy. It wasn't a raft, it was a boat, a faulty boat, and, you know, 13 people or something, and the boat collapses, and Elian and 2 others survive, but his mum dies, yeah? And Elian, you know, goes through this trauma, but he's claimed by US family, Cuban Americans, who he doesn't know, his great uncle. They say he's staying with us. You know, his mum killed herself trying to escape communism. And his father, they've divorced, the mother and father, but he's an active, loving parent, actually says, no, he's my son, you need to return him, which is international law, right? And so he writes, this guy, Miguel Gonzalez, he writes to Fidel Castro. He says, I need your help. My son's been kidnapped, right? And Fidel meets him and sees that he's in the Communist Party. He's a serious guy. He's a good parent. And he they launch a campaign on every front, a legal campaign, a political campaign, and it gets picked up internationally. There's protests and all around the world to return Elian Gonzalez to his father. And the Cuban American community invests massive capital, in a sense, in this, yeah? And the, Cuban American leading politicians are there and at the house where this kid is being held. And they lose in the end. Ultimately, there's a local Miami court cases and federal, there's a bit about it in my book, and federal court cases. And in the end, the FBI has to barge into the house at 5 a.m. and snatch the child. There's this horrific picture of like a military guy with a gun right near the head of Elian Gonzalez, someone has hidden him in a cupboard. Anyway, he's reunited with his family and he's still there. He's a sort of, he tries to keep low key, but he's a bit of a public figure, and he's a member of the Communist Party now, and he's I think computer scientist or something, I don't know. Anyway, but this coincides. So they start to say, well, why would a mother risk her life? We know what the pull factors are. The pull factor is that Cubans are the only people in the world that can turn up illegally in Cuba and within a year be granted residency, never sent back, never deported, right? Within a year be granted residency, and within 2 years be given citizenship. And they're often helped to find jobs and houses because it's a political battle. So there are evidence, all these people fleeing communism, right? But not the, I don't know how many thousands of Mexicans that, are just trying to get into the US, risking their lives every year just to survive, yeah? But the Cubans are they have a special place. So they say, all right, we know what the pull factors are, but what are the push factors? And they start a socio-economic investigation. What are the conditions in every home? And they see that there's some families that the fridge is broken, so they can't keep food fresh, so they have malnutrition and so on. So they launch this incredible thing called the Battle of Ideas, and it ends up with 700 or something social programs, thousands of young people enrolled, and they identify these women, right? Not just women, but largely women, who are outside work and employment. And they give them a protagonistic role in a new epoch of the revolution called the Battle of Ideas. They turn them into social workers. They give them access to universities, which is very competitive because it's a very high standard, yeah? It's free and universal. But, the entrance exam is extremely difficult, and they give them access and they give them a career as social workers. But they're certainly not playing a role of social workers that we think of in Britain, yeah, which can be quite antagonistic with family taking kids away and stuff like that. They are playing a different role. They are working in their own communities with their own families and neighborhoods. And they're saying, what needs do you have? And what resources do you need to meet them? So, their neighbors know them, so they trust them, so they open the door to them, and they play this incredible role. So this is one example of how the revolution can create a new sector, young sector to play a protagonistic role. Now, who's playing that role now? In what direction are they going? That's not clear. And at the moment, you have young people who are disaffected, as you're saying. They're very influenced by social media, outside work and employment, or they have a career, but they see it happening outside of Cuba because it is hard to live in Cuba, particularly now with those shortages. So they see their life ambition happening outside Cuba. But every now and then you see signs of the incredible persistence of solidarity, of mobilization. For example, when that hotel exploded, the gas canister, young people rushed over to, immediately digging up the rubble with their bare hands. I mean, I don't know, is that human instinct for everyone, or is it special Cuban sense of solidarity? Who knows? But within 2 hours, the blood bank said, please don't turn up. We've got millions, we've got thousands of people queuing to give blood. And, the same happened when they had a tornado out of the blue in 2019 that ripped up a part of Havana. And, I remember talking to the director of the Institute of Higher Instituto Superior de Higher Institute of International Relations, Isabel Allende, an older woman who'd been active in the revolution a couple of years ago, and I was asking her about the young people. And she said, if you'd asked me a few months ago, because I was in Cuba just shortly after Fidel Castro died in 2016, if you'd asked me a few months ago, I would have been more negative, disillusioned. But the response that I saw after Fidel Castro died, the sort of real, genuine, authentic, the way that young people were moved and they had a feeling that part of our history, this was a significant part of our history that they had now had the role to sustain it. And they mobilized and they were the ones, even young people who weren't in any party or anything, they were deeply moved and they mobilized memorials and told anyone who was listening to a radio to switch it off and all this sort of stuff. So it's interesting. It's difficult and it's very challenging. But, let's not slip down that slippery slope of Cuban exceptionalism. It is a challenge everywhere in the world. I mean, we were talking yesterday, I was talking to Anna, about pre-COVID. There was a youth movement about the environment. They were all over, apparently here in Slovenia, certainly in Glasgow, certainly in the UK. Where is it now? So this is a universal problem, and the Cubans are going to have to find a way to tackle those problems, which, is in the spirit of the collective participatory response of the Cuban Revolution. And it's challenging, and I certainly don't have the answers.
Are there any more questions?
Oh, we've gone over time.
If not, I would like to thank you all for the lively discussion, which we can continue now over lunch on the ground floor of the Institute. And we will continue with our panel at 2 p.m. So everyone welcome at 2 p.m. To continue with the second session.
Thank you.